By the time most of you are reaching for the snooze button a second time, I am already outside, standing in my own garden, doing nothing more complicated than letting the morning light hit my face. No supplement, no expensive machine, no app tracking anything. Just my eyes open, facing the sky for roughly the same 10 minutes it takes you to scroll through your phone before you've even gotten out of bed. I want to tell you a number before I tell you anything else because I think the number alone should stop you. Researchers tracked light exposure in more than 88,000 adults over several years, using small sensors worn on the body day and night, then followed what happened to each of them. The people whose days were brightest and whose nights were darkest had as much as a third lower risk of dying during the study period than the people whose days were dim and whose nights stayed lit. Not a third lower risk of one disease, a third lower risk of dying from any cause during the years researchers were watching. Sit with that number for a moment because I don't think it gets the attention it deserves. We are used to hearing about medications that reduce risk of a specific disease by 5 or 10%, and treating that as remarkable, worth a headline, worth a doctor's recommendation. A third lower risk of dying from anything at all, tied to nothing more than when you happen to see light and when you don't, should by any reasonable measure be considered one of the more important findings in health research in recent years. I don't think it has been treated that way, and I want to spend the rest of this video showing you exactly why I believe that and exactly what to do about it. I am not a doctor, and I want to say that plainly before I go any further, the way I always do. But I have spent 93 years doing something researchers only recently found a name and a number for, and I think it deserves far more attention than it currently gets, buried as it usually is beneath advice about diet and exercise that, however true, misses something simpler sitting right above all our heads every single morning. My name is Sachiko. I am 93 years old, and I live in the hills of northern Okinawa, near a village called Ogimi. I have told you before about what I eat and how my community cares for each other, and I don't want to repeat all of that today. I want to tell you about something smaller than any of it, something so ordinary I never once thought to mention it as a habit at all, until researchers started asking me quite specifically what time I got up and what I did in the first hour after waking. Here's what I actually do, and I want to describe it plainly rather than dramatically, because I think the plainness is the entire point. I wake before sunrise most days without an alarm because my body has kept roughly the same schedule for 7 decades now. I do not reach for tea first or the newspaper or Kenji's breakfast. I go outside. I walk to the garden, barefoot most mornings unless the ground is too cold, and I simply stand there or kneel and pull a few weeds while the sky changes color above me. I am not doing anything a researcher would call exercise. I am doing something closer to nothing at all, except that my eyes are open and they are facing a sky that is getting brighter by the minute. I have done this so consistently for so many decades that I genuinely cannot remember deciding to start. There was no morning I chose this habit the way you might choose to start a diet or a new class. It simply accumulated one unremarkable sunrise at a time until it became something closer to breathing than two. Decision, the kind of habit you'd struggle to break even if you tried, because your body has quietly built its entire day around the assumption that it will happen. On the rare mornings illness or bad weather kept me indoors well past sunrise, I noticed, even before I understood why, that I felt oddly unsettled for the rest of that day, slightly out of step with myself in a way I couldn't have explained at the time. Kenji has never joined me in the garden itself, not really. His knees have made kneeling difficult. For years now, longer than most of what I've told you about in earlier videos. But even since his body began needing more help from me, he still insists on sitting just outside the back door each morning, in a low chair I set out for him, facing the same brightening sky I'm facing a few meters away. Neither of us has ever discussed why this particular habit was worth preserving when so much else about. Our mornings has had to change around his needs. I think we both simply understood, without needing the research to tell us, that this was one part of the day neither of us wanted to lose, however much everything else around it had to bend. Let me explain why this matters, because the mechanism itself is not complicated, even though it took scientists a long time to measure it properly. Every cell in your body runs on an internal clock, coordinated by a master timekeeper in a small region of your brain. And that master clock is set, more than by anything else, by light hitting your eyes. Morning light carries a particular signal your body reads as the day has begun, triggering a cascade that affects your cortisol, your metabolism, and critically, the timing of when melatonin will rise later that evening too, help you sleep. Researchers describe this as circadian entrainment, your internal rhythm locking into alignment with the actual 24-hour cycle of the Earth turning. When that alignment holds steady day after day, your body handles blood sugar more efficiently. Your blood pressure follows a healthier daily pattern, and your immune system appears to function measurably better. When that alignment breaks down dim days, bright nights, and irregular schedule, researchers have found the opposite: worse metabolic health, higher rates of cardiovascular disease, and now, in the largest studies, a meaningfully higher risk of dying earlier than expected. I think what makes this different from most health advice is worth pausing on directly. This isn't a nutrient you're adding or a toxin you're avoiding. The way most advice about eating or drinking works, it's timing. The same 8 hours of daylight available to you today would do almost nothing for this particular system if you experience them entirely through a window at your desk with the blinds mostly closed, or if you slept through the morning and only went outside well into the afternoon. Researchers have found the clock cares specifically about when light arrives relative to your own waking hour, not simply how much total daylight exists somewhere in your day. Two people living under the identical sky can be having entirely different circadian experiences, depending on nothing more than which hour each of them chooses to step outside. The study I mentioned at the start, published in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences, followed people using data from the UK Biobank, and its authors were careful about what they could and couldn't conclude. But a separate line of research makes the same point from a different angle, and I find it just as striking. Researchers studying more than 80,000 adults, average age around 60, found that people who stayed indoors under dim lighting and rarely went out into bright daylight died at roughly a 30% higher rate over the following years than those who got the most daily sunlight. And this held even though the same group getting more sun exposure also showed slightly more skin cancer, a cost real enough to mention honestly, but one the researchers found was overwhelmed entirely by the much larger reduction in deaths from other causes, particularly cardiovascular disease. I think what surprises people most when I explain this is learning that the danger runs in both directions. Not only too little light during the day, but too much light at night. Researchers looking at that same large data set found that exposure to light between roughly 2:30 and 3 in the morning specifically was associated with a striking increase in cardiometabolic deaths, somewhere between 50 and 60% higher risk in the most exposed group. A phone screen, a hallway light left on, a television still playing in the next room, these small, ordinary sources of light, arriving at exactly the hour your body least expects them, appear to do real, measurable damage over years of repetition in a way no single night of it would ever reveal. I did not know any of these numbers when I was a young woman rising early to tend a garden. Nobody in my family ever explained the word cortisol to me, or melatonin, or circadian anything. My mother woke early because there was work to do before the heat became unbearable. And I woke early because that was simply what our house did, every single morning without discussion. It was habit passed down as practicality, not medicine. I only learned much later that the practicality and the medicine happened to be the same thing, arrived at by two entirely different routes. My grandmother's necessity and a scientist's sensor data pointing at exactly the same hour of the exactly the same kind of morning. I want to walk you through what this actually looks like here, because I think the specifics matter more than the general idea. Across this island and across much of Japan, you will find something visitors often find strange the first time they see it. Groups of elderly people, sometimes dozens at once, gathered in public parks before 7 in the morning, doing slow, simple stretching exercises together in the open air, facing whatever light the sky is offering that day. This is not a formal medical program, though some versions of it are organized by community centers. It is simply what generations here have done, treating the early morning as something worth being outside for, rather than something to sleep through until the last possible moment. I have joined these groups myself, on and off, for decades, less for the stretching itself, which is gentle enough to barely count as exercise, more for the simple, repeated act of being outdoors, in the light, at the same hour, alongside other people doing the same thing. There is something in the combination of those two things, light and company, arriving at exactly the same moment, that I think matters more than either one would alone. Nobody in that park is checking a sunrise chart or timing their exposure with any precision. They are simply showing up because their neighbors are showing up, because it has always been the hour people gather, and the light happens to be doing its work on all of them, regardless of whether a single person present understands why. I think this is often how the most effective habits survive across generations, not because anyone explains the mechanism, but because the habit gets folded into something social, something slightly embarrassing to skip once your neighbors have noticed your absence, until the biology and the community reinforce each other so thoroughly that neither one could easily be pulled apart from the other. I want to be honest with you now about the limits of what I've told you, because I think a habit this simple, described too confidently, starts to sound like a miracle cure, and I don't believe it is one. Much of the research linking daylight exposure to lower mortality is observational, meaning researchers tracked what people already did and then looked at what happened to them, rather than randomly assigning some people to get more sunlight and others less, the way a stricter experiment would. That matters because people who go outside every morning may simply be healthier, more mobile, and more socially connected to begin with, for reasons that have nothing to do with the light itself. And researchers doing this kind of work go to real lengths to account for that possibility statistically, adjusting for physical activity, employment, income, and social factors. But no adjustment fully replaces a true experiment. The biological mechanism, how light affects your internal clock, is well established in laboratory research and tested rigorously in controlled conditions. The size of its effect on how long any one person actually lives is harder to pin down with total certainty, and I think you deserve that distinction rather than a tedious story of that distinction or a tedious story. I also want to say plainly that this habit did not, on its own, keep my sister from dying of breast cancer 11 years ago, or spare any of the friends I've buried over the decades from whatever eventually took them. Morning light is not armor. It is one thread among many diet, movement, community, whatever genetics you were born with, and I think the honest way to describe its role is that it appears to load the odds gently in your favor over years of repetition, rather than protecting anyone from any single specific threat. I would rather you understand it that way from the start than have you expect too much of it and feel betrayed later, the way I've watched people feel betrayed by promises made about far more expensive things than sunlight. There is one more honest complication I should mention because I think it matters for anyone living somewhere. The sun simply isn't reliable for large stretches of the year. I have never lived through a true northern winter, the kind where daylight itself is scarce for months, rather than merely cloudy on a given morning, and I don't want to pretend my experience translates perfectly to a life like that. Researchers studying seasonal light deprivation in far northern latitudes have found real, measurable effects on mood and circadian health during those darkest months. And some recommend supplementing natural light with specifically designed bright light devices during that season, since ordinary indoor lighting genuinely cannot substitute for what real daylight provides, however long you stood beneath it. If you live somewhere like that, this habit may need real adaptation, not just willingness during the hardest months of your year. And I don't think it would be honest of me to suggest otherwise. I've wondered why something this simple, this well-documented now, isn't discussed more urgently, the way a new medication might be. I don't think anyone is hiding it from you. I think the honest explanation is almost too plain to be satisfying. There is no product to sell here. Nobody can patent morning sunlight or charge you a monthly fee for continuing to stand in your own yard. The blackout curtains and smart light bulbs marketed as sleep solutions borrow, at best, a small piece of this research wrapped around something you do have to pay for. The actual habit, walking outside early before you've done anything else, has no company built around promoting it. And I think that silence gets mistaken by a lot of people for a lack of importance. There is a second, quieter reason too, I think, which has more to do with how modern life is built than with anyone hiding anything. Many of you wake up already indoors under artificial light and stay that way for hours before you ever see real daylight inside for breakfast, inside for the commute, inside for work under fluorescent lights that never quite carry the same signal the actual sun does. It is not that people don't it's not that people don't morning. It is that a great deal of modern life has been built gradually and without much discussion around a schedule that keeps people indoors during precisely the hours their bodies most need to be outside. I think there's a third reason too, harder to say plainly, but worth saying anyway. This habit asks for very little in the way of proof of effort. There is no receipt, no membership card, no visible transformation to photograph and share. A person who has faithfully stepped outside every morning for 30 years has, in most ways that modern life rewards, nothing to show for it, no certificate, no before and after. I think a culture that increasingly measures wellness by what can be documented and displayed has an odd blind spot for a habit whose entire value happens invisibly. Inside cells nobody can see over a stretch of decades. Nobody has the patience to photograph. If you'd like to build something closer to what I do, here is what I would actually suggest, in the order I'd suggest trying it. Within the first hour of waking, before coffee, before your phone, go outside, even briefly, even in poor weather. Researchers studying this consistently find morning light carries the strongest circadian signal, more effective at the same brightness than afternoon or evening light. So the timing matters as much as the exposure itself. You do not need direct sun on a clear day to benefit. Even outdoor light on an overcast morning is considerably brighter than any indoor lighting, often by a factor of 10 or more. So cloudy weather is not a reasonable excuse to skip it. 10 to 15 minutes is enough for most people, according to the research, not ours. Try to do this at roughly the same time each day, not simply whenever you happen to wake. The research on circadian entrainment suggests consistency itself carries real weight. A body that receives its light signal at an unpredictable hour each morning struggles to build the same stable rhythm as one that receives it reliably, even if the total weekly exposure ends up similar on paper. If your schedule genuinely varies day to day, I'd still suggest anchoring to whatever regularity you can manage, even if it's simply shortly after waking rather than a fixed clock time. If you cannot get outside, illness, mobility, a genuine scheduling conflict, sitting near a bright window for that same window of time captures a meaningful portion of the benefit. Though real outdoor light remains considerably stronger, since ordinary window glass filters out a portion of the relevant light. If you have a porch, a balcony, even a doorway you can stand in rather than a full garden to walk into, that's enough. This was never about acreage. And on the other end of your day, protect the hours before and during sleep the way you'd protect anything else you now understand carries real risk. Dim household lights after sunset rather than leaving everything full brightness. Keep your bedroom genuinely dark rather than lit by a hallway bulb or a charging phone. And if you wake in the night, resist turning on a bright light or checking a screen, particularly in those early hours between roughly 2 and 4 in the morning when the research suggests your body is most vulnerable to that specific disruption. A small amber or red nightlight, if you need something at all for safety reasons, appears to interfere far less with this system than a standard white or blue-toned light. I would not try to overhaul your entire relationship with light in a single week. Start with the morning piece alone for a month before you add the evening piece on top of it. I think habits built one honest layer at a time tend to last considerably longer than the ones assembled all at once out of urgency, and this particular habit, more than most, rewards patience over intensity. None of this requires a garden or an island or 70 years of habit behind you already. It requires deciding tomorrow morning to walk outside before you do anything else, and then deciding the same thing again the next morning, and the one after that until it stops feeling like a decision at all. Kenji is calling for his tea now, so I should go back inside, though I notice, even after telling you all of this, that I've been standing out here a good deal longer than the 10 minutes the researchers say is enough. Old habits, I suppose, rarely check the clock as carefully as the studies do. Tell me, if you'd like, what time you usually wake, and whether daylight is the first thing you see or the last thing you think about. I read what people share. This time, I'd like to tell you about the evenings in this house instead of the mornings, what we do deliberately to protect the darkness the same way we protect the light, and why I think the two halves of the day were never meant to be treated so differently from each other. Thank you for sitting with me this morning.